Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Current, founder of the Current Consulting Group, and welcome to another edition of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. Today, we have with us Yvette Farnsworth Baker. She is an attorney working for Current Consulting Group, and we're going to talk about two very significant new marijuana laws, Ohio and Minnesota. Welcome, Yvette.
Thank you, Belle. It's great to be here with you as always.
Now, I know you track these laws regularly. If something comes up, I know you're on top of it. Catherine Miller from our staff, the two of you stay very up to date on legislation, on voter initiatives, etc. And these two new laws in Ohio and Minnesota are significant for a couple of reasons because they affect, in some ways, workplace drug testing. So let's start with Minnesota. My understanding is that Minnesota is a little bit more restrictive when it comes to the workplace than the Ohio law. And I should point out that many state marijuana laws have language in them that could or does directly affect the workplace, what employers can do with the drug test result, how they can act upon it, etc. And so let's talk about Minnesota first, Yvette.
Sure. So, Minnesota legalized recreational marijuana, and as part of their marijuana legalization, their recreational marijuana legalization law, there were specific parts of that law that restrict what employers can do with marijuana positives. Now, it is still permissible to test for marijuana in the workplace in Minnesota. But one of the biggest restrictions is what an employer can do with a marijuana positive. Now, the Minnesota law allows an employer to discipline an employee or to terminate employment if they have evidence that an employee was impaired on the job, impaired by marijuana while at work, or possessed marijuana at work, or used marijuana at work. However, if all an employer has is a positive marijuana test, but they do not have proof that that employee was impaired on the job or possessed marijuana on the job or used marijuana on the job, the law prohibits disciplinary action just based on that marijuana positive. So, what that means is for employers in Minnesota, they really need to step up their game on identifying impairment in the workplace and documenting um, behaviors by employees that might indicate impairment by marijuana. Because if they get a marijuana positive, and they also have evidence that that person's performance has decreased or they've exhibited signs of impairment while on the job, then they're perfectly within their rights to discipline that employee, pull that employee, off the job, terminate employment. But if they've done nothing but got a marijuana positive, then they're going to be limited in what they can do with that. There's one other thing
So,
I do want to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, so employers in Minnesota can still test for marijuana, but they may be limited in what they can do with a positive drug test result. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's a good segue though into there is a little bit of limitation on the testing for marijuana. This is something a little bit new that we have not seen other states do, but the Minnesota law prohibits testing for marijuana in an arbitrary or capricious manner. What exactly that means, we're not clear on yet. It might mean that employers are prohibited from random testing for marijuana with no accident, no reasonable suspicion, no reason to test someone for marijuana other than it's just scheduled to do so. But it's not entirely clear that yes, that's what that law means. So we're still kind of waiting to see how that plays out in Minnesota.
Now, Minnesota is a state that has a very specific drug testing law, a mandatory drug testing law, right?
Right.
So, what would an employer, let's say that you're a Minnesota employer, you're an employer with in multi-states, but you have operations in Minnesota, you're going to have to comply with both the laws, right? The drug testing law and the marijuana law.
Exactly. So employers who are, especially employers who are multi-state employees, multi-state employers, but who operate in Minnesota, they're going to need to have a specific policy or an addenda to their policy that's specific to Minnesota to make sure that they're complying with all the nuances of Minnesota drug testing law, including this new recreational marijuana law. So, an employer who has a blanket policy that's supposed to cover many states, including Minnesota, there's no way it's going to work in Minnesota. You have to have a Minnesota specific policy or a Minnesota specific addendum, which is what we usually do at Current Consulting Group. We have a specific addendum to go to the policy that only applies to Minnesota employees.
Now, on the other end of the spectrum, voters in 2023 in Ohio voted to legalize recreational marijuana, but it's a different kind of a law or a different approach, it sounds like to me.
Yeah, so the Ohio recreational marijuana law, that was something that was a voter initiative, not done by the state legislature. But the Ohio law specifically protects an employer's right to have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to marijuana. Employers in Ohio can take a marijuana positive test result and just based on that alone discipline or terminate employment for that employee. They're not required to show proof of impairment on the job or use on the job. That was actually written right into the recreational marijuana law in Ohio.
So it sounds like Ohio maybe is a little bit more employer friendly. And I don't want to say Minnesota is not employer friendly, but it sounds like Ohio is just a little bit more employer friendly than Minnesota's new law.
Right, at least when it comes to recreational marijuana.
Okay. And it's important also to note that in Ohio, unlike Minnesota, Ohio has a voluntary drug testing law. And Yvette and I have another podcast on that subject. We invite you to find it in our archives and take a look at that. But companies in Ohio who choose to drug test according to certain procedural guidelines provided by the state would follow that law. But outside of that voluntary law, those conditions wouldn't apply. But the marijuana law still would be applicable to them, right?
Yes, the marijuana law is still going to be a mandatory law. But like we said, it's not restrictive to employers. It doesn't affect the way if they choose to accept marijuana positives, they're free to do so. If they want to terminate employment based on a marijuana positive, they're free to do so. So, yeah, like you've said, Ohio is very employer friendly, and there's a lot of freedom in what employers can choose to put into their workplace drug testing policies in Ohio, especially as compared to Minnesota.
Excellent. Thank you, Yvette. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this edition of Currently Speaking. If you have any questions about the new Minnesota law or the new Ohio law, or any questions about state laws or drug testing issues, here's our information. You can contact either one of us, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. And that concludes this edition of Currently Speaking.